We'll go ahead and get the ball rolling on today's event. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin Hopkins, and I'm the director of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies and the co-director of the East Asia National Resource Center. It's my great privilege to welcome you to our October New Books in Asian Studies. This is part of a series that we've been doing here at the Sigur Center, where we're presenting recently published books pertinent to Asian studies. We've had a really fantastic time and turnout since we began this back in June, and I think we have another fantastic talk for you today. I have two colleagues that I'm going to present to you that are from the Elliott School at the George Washington University. So we're advertising some homegrown talent, as it were, with Sean Roberts, the author, talking about his newly published book today, and Eric Schluessel, a newly joined professor of Chinese history, who's going to be moderating as the discussant today. Just a couple of ground rules before we go ahead and start the substance of the event. I'd just like to remind you all that this event is being recorded and it will be shared on YouTube next week once we get it all cleaned up in terms of the video editing. Also, as we've been doing for our New Books in Asian Studies series, and will continue to do with this series today, the Sigur Center is offering a book giveaway to attendees with a US address who follow the event, the Sigur Center and the MA in International Development Studies, which Sean Roberts is the director of, on Twitter. And those are GWUSIGUR for the Sigur Center and GWUIDS. In terms of today's event, I'd also remind you that there's plenty of opportunity for questions that are going to be coming in. On the sidebar, you will see a Q&A panel. Please put your questions there, and our moderator, Eric Schluessel, will integrate those into today's discussion. The final thing I'd like to do before I turn this over to Eric is to also give a pitch for Eric's book, which has just come out this month, and which we will be hosting a New Books in Asian Studies talk in the spring. So keep your eyes peeled for that announcement coming soon. Again, it's my great pleasure to welcome Eric and Sean, and I think we're in for a real treat today. And so I'll turn off my video and mute myself and pass it over to Eric so we can get into the event. Eric.
All right. No, it is also my great pleasure to be in dialogue with Professor Sean Roberts. And I've been asked to begin by praising Sean and his book, The War on the Uyghurs, for a few minutes. And this is sincere praise because I deeply enjoyed this book and I found it very useful. This is a book in which Sean presents a compelling and empirically grounded analysis of the ongoing crisis in the Uyghur or Uyghur homeland in northwest China, East Turkestan, or Xinjiang. And this book illuminates complex and unexpected connections across Eurasia and the world while debunking several myths about Chinese policies in the region. So I'll say that ever since Professor Roberts's 1996 documentary, Waiting for Uyghurstan, which I think you can find on YouTube, this was a documentary that he crafted from interviews with Uyghur people living in post-Soviet Central Asia. And since then, he's been known for taking this intimate approach to issues that play out on a grand geopolitical scale, issues like transnationality, or in this book, the global war on terror. By prioritizing Uyghur voices and by putting Uyghur lives at the center, he not only retells these stories in ways that are more convincing or compelling, but he produces empirically rich, theoretically engaged, critical, and if I may venture to say it, anti-colonial work that leads us to rethink power, politics, and borders in the Eurasian space. So this is an approach that certainly influenced how I've done my research and writing, and I think it's helped to set a standard in the field of what we might call Uyghur studies. This new book, 24 years after Waiting for Uyghurstan, The War on the Uyghurs, China's internal campaign against the Muslim minority, is a great example of that kind of scholarship. Now, I speak as someone who's been in this field in some capacity in Uyghur studies for about 15 years. And for the past several years, if you've been reading the news, you know that we've witnessed not only a flood of media attention about the Uyghur homeland and what's happening there, but thanks to tireless work on behalf of some really heroic volunteers, many of them in Kazakhstan, where Sean has done much of his field work, but also in Turkey and across the world. We have seen thousands of eyewitness testimonies, leaked documents, public documents, white papers, data-driven studies that all illuminate different aspects of what this book calls cultural genocide. That is the wholesale elimination of the Uyghur way of life. And if you're like me, that information can be exhausting and overwhelming. There is suddenly so much coming out about this place that many of us didn't know much about until a couple of years ago. So in the midst of that torrent of information, I found this book, The War on the Uyghurs, to be immensely clarifying. That is to say that by centering Uyghur lives and Uyghur voices through interviews with people from China to Turkey to Afghanistan to Syria and around the world, Sean has reorganized all of these confusing and conflicting stories into a compelling, coherent, grounded, and accessible account. And in my view, this would be the book that I would give someone, not only to introduce them to the current situation in the Uyghur homeland, but also to help them come to a much more nuanced and critical perspective on that situation. So that's my little bit of praise. Once again, what a pleasure it is to speak today with Sean Roberts about his new book. I look forward to our discussion. But first, I think Sean is meant to introduce his own work in a little bit more detail. So, Sean, if you would.
Thank you, Eric. That was very nice praise indeed. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank the Sigur Center for organizing this event and hosting it. And as well, I want to thank Eric for moderating it. I think in many ways, this book is difficult to categorize in any given academic discipline. I myself am an anthropologist, but I noticed that Princeton University Press categorized it on their webpage as political science. Actually, when I was writing the book, I felt that it primarily reads like a history in the sense that it's trying to explain how and why the situation inside China for Uyghurs has so dramatically spiraled into what I call a cultural genocide since 2017. And that's why I'm particularly pleased to have one of the most gifted young historians of the Uyghurs discussing it with me today. I think it will be an interesting discussion indeed. First, I should mention that when I started working on this book in 2015, I imagined it looking quite differently. At the time, I was intending to write a book that was a critical investigation of how the global war on terror had impacted Uyghurs, with a secondary purpose of investigating China's claims since 2001 that it has faced a serious terrorist threat from within its Uyghur population. And this remains kind of the centerpiece of the book and offers, I think, its most original research. But the larger project began to change in 2017 as it became necessary to also explain how and why things had gotten just so much worse in the region and for Uyghurs in general. In my book, I suggest that part of the reason for this deterioration in the situation in the Uyghur homeland is related to the initiation of the US-led global war on terror. Throughout the 1990s, the Chinese state frequently characterized any signs of Uyghur dissent or disloyalty as an indication of a separatist threat. And I think that the term separatism itself is politically loaded, but it's not quite, it doesn't carry quite the same connotations as a terrorist threat. And with the advent of the global war on terror, the PRC began reframing Uyghur dissent and disloyalty instead as a terrorist threat. And the suggestion that a terrorist threat existed within the Uyghur population inside China subsequently both allowed for increased state violence to be employed against Uyghur dissent with, I think, international impunity, but it also facilitated a gradual biopolitical perspective that all Uyghurs pose a threat to state and society. However, I wanted to be careful in my book to avoid characterizing the present policies of the Chinese state vis-a-vis Uyghurs as a reaction to a perceived terrorist threat. And this has been something that some scholars have argued. And the primary reason I wanted to avoid that is I found very little evidence that this perceived threat actually had ever been salient. And I'm assuming that Chinese intelligence is capable enough to come to similar conclusions. So for this reason, I also examine what's happening to Uyghurs inside China today from a longer historical perspective of the relationship between modern China and this particular population, or perhaps even more importantly, with this population's territory. In doing so, I characterize this relationship as having long been colonial. However, until the 1990s, the nature of this colonial relationship was more akin to that between metropole and frontier. The region hadn't been significantly developed. The demographics had changed after the Communist Party came to power, but most of the Han population remained isolated in the north, and the south of this region was still overwhelmingly Uyghur in character and in population. Um, I think that since the 1990s, the relationship has gradually changed and is now more appropriately characterized as settler colonialism. The PRC now wants to settle the region that Uyghurs view as their homeland and make it increasingly like other parts of China. In doing so, the Uyghurs themselves are viewed as superfluous and requiring containment, depopulation, displacement, and ultimate marginalization. And I think this is a very common strategy of settler colonial powers with regards to the indigenous peoples of the lands that they are settling, and explains why settler colonialism almost always entails some form of cultural genocide. But it's also a strategy that's easily masked as counterterrorism. And for this reason, my book suggests that what we're witnessing in the Uyghur homeland today is cultural genocide in the name of, but not motivated by, counterterrorism. And I'll leave my kind of general overview at that, and we can have our discussion.
Well, thank you, Sean, very much. Since you brought up the question of terrorism and settler colonialism, you're unpacking some of the big concepts that are active in this book. One thing that is immediately apparent to a reader is that you're working with questions of definition. So for the benefit of the audience here, what is terrorism? How do you define it? And why does it matter that we have to define it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I realized when I started working on this project, and I was very surprised by this, in fact, not having really delved before into the literature on terrorism, that there is no international consensus on what terrorism is or what constitutes a terrorist. And in fact, a lot of the academic literature itself just kind of takes this for granted and writes it off as saying, well, of course, given the politicized nature of this topic, there's not going to be an international consensus. But if I was going to interrogate the veracity of the Chinese state's claims that it faced a terrorist threat, I felt that I needed to at least have a definition, a working definition for my book as to what constitutes terrorism. And in my view, the core issue and the thing that is really condemnable about terrorism is that it's political violence that deliberately targets civilians. I think that we can all agree, if we look at any terrorist incident that we can think of, the issue that disturbs us the most about those incidents is that there's innocent lives taken. And I think this is important because it also places non-state actors in the same, it places them responsible for the same actions of state actors in conflict. You know, we as a world, we have decided that sometimes war is necessary, or at least is legitimate. But we also say that states engaged in combat should not target civilians. And so non-state actors being held to the same account, I think, is important. And that, so in looking at the question of what violence in the Uyghur homeland, you know, starting from the 1990s, in going to the present day, which events should be characterized as terrorist events, I focused particularly on this issue of whether they were targeting civilians.
So by that definition, you have this assertion that between 1997 and 2014, despite the existence of violent incidents involving protesters being shot by police, for example, or sporadic violence, there is no incident involving Uyghurs that can be definitely accurately described as terrorism, which is really interesting in itself. So before we get to the question of what happened in 2014, I think it might be reasonable to ask, given what you describe as settler colonialism, given the worsening economic inequalities that we saw in the region between Han settlers and Uyghur people and others, given the growing oppression during this period, given the fact that there was a major riot in Urumshi in the summer of 2009, which a couple of hundred people died, some people have asked in the past, why are Uyghurs so violent? But it sounds like the question we have to ask based on your book is, why aren't Uyghurs so violent? Why aren't Uyghurs engaged in organized violent resistance? Why are they so peaceful? Because this seems like really fertile ground for some kind of armed movement to rise up on the basis of social and economic injustice. Do you have an answer for that? Why is Xinjiang actually very peaceful?
Yeah, no, that's been a question I think that's always puzzled me. In the 1990s, I remember wondering why there was not any sort of militant political movement within the Uyghur population. And you know, as I talk about in my book, there's one group, a very small group with very little capacity that forms in Afghanistan during that time. But really, during that period, I was mostly based in Kazakhstan and knew all of the most fervent Uyghur nationalists in Kazakhstan. I never heard of this organization whatsoever, and when it was recognized actually by the U.S. as a terrorist organization, I was somewhat surprised that it existed, but I was also not surprised that, you know, something like that might form. I would think that, you know, given the proximity to to Afghanistan and some of the injustices faced by Uyghurs, that you would see something of a more militant movement form. But really, you know, if you look at the history, the modern history of Uyghurs, there has been very little violent resistance. You know, and I think that another component of this is that I think people are particularly surprised, and they shouldn't be, but they're particularly surprised because Uyghurs are Muslim. And I think since 9/11, we've come to internalize this kind of stereotype that for some reason Muslim populations are more violent, which I think is a completely inaccurate stereotype, but it's been internalized by so many people. So, you know, there's an assumption that, well, Uyghurs obviously must be more violent than, say, Tibetans. But you know, if it would be interesting to look at that in actual comparison to see if that is actually the case over the last 100 years.
Well, this sounds like a good time to talk about what happens in 2014, this turning point that you describe, and your notion of the self-fulfilling prophecy, because you have this assertion that, you know, as is documented, there are Uyghur people, there's a Uyghur presence in Syria today. And when I've spoken with Chinese terrorism scholars or strategy experts, they point to that as one of the signs that if there's an international Uyghur population in associated with some kind of organization like Al Qaeda, then therefore there must be branches of it in the Uyghur homeland, and therefore these measures are necessary. So, explain to me how this happened. How did Uyghurs end up in Syria? And how is that, as you put it, a byproduct of this self-fulfilling prophecy? What is the self-fulfilling prophecy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, first of all, I think people are very aware of the usage of that term in popular discourse, self-fulfilling prophecy. You think something might happen and then it happens. But it really comes from early American sociology. Robert Merton had developed this concept to discuss structural racism in the U.S. in the ways that belief, in today's world, we might talk about this as implicit bias, right? That by having ideas that a certain population is less capable or backward or less interested in education, what happens is the policies form with those assumptions and help make sure that that population is less educated and poorer and suffers all kinds of discrimination. And this seemed to be a really good concept for understanding what had happened to Uyghurs, I think, since the 1980s, but in particular, we see it really start to happen after the Urumshi Riots in 2009, which I think are a really important watershed moment in the relationship between the Chinese state and Uyghurs, because those riots, which I describe as is an outcome of kind of the tensions of development in the region, development both bringing in Han settlers and for those Han settlers, that's a lot of tension. I mean, labor migrants are always suffering all kinds of difficulties, but at the same time, you have the Uyghur population seeing these people as an encroachment on their homeland. And, you had 3 days of just unbridled ethnic violence that was obviously not planned. That was really an outgrowth, I think, of tensions on both sides between Han and Uyghurs, and it included Han vigilantes who were carrying out violence as well as Uyghurs who were carrying out violence. But the state, after that, completely blamed Uyghurs for the violence, and in particular, blamed those Uyghur labor migrants from the southern region of the Uyghur homeland. And as a result, the pressure that was put on Uyghurs in the south was intensified to such a degree. I mean, it kind of really reminds me of some of the debates we're having in the US right now about police harassment and brutality in African American communities. You have these security forces going into rural Uyghur communities. Anybody who is religious is under suspicion. They're being surveilled. Police are coming in and doing random house checks. And throughout that period from 2009 to 2014, you start to see a lot of violence happening in the south of the Uyghur region, but this doesn't look like premeditated political violence. It looks like clashes between security forces and Uyghur populations, and often, just a family. Some of the events are just happen when the security forces are doing these house searches, and the family gets upset, and something happens. We don't know the details, but it turns violent. And then we also have instances where Uyghurs have lashed out at police, perhaps because family members have been arrested, or they're just feeling that they've been harassed to such an extent. And so this violence, I think it particularly in the context where the Chinese state continues to label it as terrorism, just continually escalates. Both with every incident of violence, you get more repression from and more securitization from the security forces and more animosity from the Uyghur population. And I think that gets to a certain point by 2014 that we see a limited number of political instances of political violence that look premeditated and indeed target civilians. And probably the first, there's a debatable one in late 2013 where a Uyghur family drove an SUV into Tiananmen Square, but that one is I think too murky to necessarily definitively call a terrorist attack. But the one in the Kunming train station in 2014 very much looks like a terrorist attack. And then there's subsequently 3 or 4 more of those in 2014, 2015, depending on how you categorize some of these different violent events. And so that I mean, I think it's the idea is that in terms of the self-fulfilling prophecy, by labeling Uyghurs as a terrorist threat and dehumanizing them to such a point and subjecting them to constant security checks, they essentially create the terrorist threat that they've been claiming so long to have faced.
And so what I understand from your book is that, so for example, that incident at the Kunming train station was related to the human trafficking of Uyghurs who were trying to leave the homeland all the way across China through Southeast Asia in order to be smuggled to places like Turkey, where a lot of Uyghurs still live in a sort of a state of statelessness, right? So there does seem to be a connection between Uyghur migration to elsewhere and the sort of socioeconomic and security issues that are coming up in the homeland.
So, thanks for reminding me. I answered half of the question.
I asked about 3 questions at once, so that's on me. I apologize.
So yes, I mean, I think the self-fulfilling prophecy can be there's 2 ways that it manifests itself at this time. One is the violence inside China, and some Uyghur-led attacks that look indeed to be terrorism. And secondly, you have, starting in 2009, people starting to flee from the Uyghur region, Uyghurs fleeing, and they're, to understand how much pressure must have been on these people. Uyghurs are very attached to their land, to their hometowns, to their families. People left everything behind with the promise of being able to leave the country, and apparently, according to people who took these routes outside of China through Southeast Asia, eventually to Turkey, that I interviewed, they were approached by Han-led human trafficking networks that basically suggested that was a possibility. If they wanted to leave, they just needed to pay a certain. They would be essentially shuttled across the border down in Yunnan province over into Southeast Asia. And at the same time, the Chinese government suggested that these people were all intending to join terrorist groups. The people I interviewed, at least, and it's certainly not all of the people, there's probably about 30,000 people left between 2010 and 2013, 14, through these routes. They told me that they just wanted to leave, and they actually intended to get to Turkey because they had heard that they could live in Turkey peacefully, that the Turkish government would allow them to settle there. Subsequently, some of these people Well, first of all, I mean, all of the Uyghurs who arrived in Turkey at this time were not welcomed in the way perhaps they had hoped. They weren't necessarily given citizenship. They were often given 1-year residency permits, sometimes without the right to work. They weren't identified as refugees and weren't given any assistance that way. The existing Uyghur community in Turkey was trying to help them in any way possible. But for a lot of them, they became very prone to recruiters who were also in Turkey at that time, trying to bring them to Syria. And they brought a significant number of Uyghurs across the Turkish border into Syria. And it's interesting when you look at some of the media reports from the Middle East about this. This population was always pointed out by journalists, by local journalists, as being very odd because, unlike most foreign fighters in Syria, these people came with their entire families, and they looked more like settlers, and they weren't interested in enforcing Sharia law locally. They weren't necessarily taking taxes from local communities. They just seemed to want to settle. And essentially, these people were given in Syria, they were given places to live. They were given schools for their children in the Uyghur language. And they were given food and the ability to raise their families. In exchange for that, the men had to go and fight in the Syrian civil war. And I think, most of the people who came there, I think some of them came just out of desperation. Some also mentioned going there because they believed that this was finally the group that was going to liberate their homeland, that they were going to get combat experience, and that after Syria, they were going to go to the Uyghur homeland and liberate it from the Chinese state. And a lot of the people I interviewed in Turkey who had been in Syria actually, they had left because they realized at some point they were never going to do that. And that, they realized the Syrian civil war was not really their war to fight.
It's remarkably reminiscent of the stories of the Guantanamo Uyghurs, like the men who, for the most part, seem to have been economic migrants trying to find somewhere to go in Afghanistan, who end up getting sold to the US by bounty hunters and held in Guantanamo for a long time, even if I recall correctly, at one point interrogated by Chinese personnel. And now are doing things like delivering pizzas in strange parts of the world. It's a sad trajectory where these poor guys were just trying to make a better life for themselves. And even so one thing that really struck me about this book was you look at that community in Afghanistan, Hassan Mahsum's community, and you point out that, the Taliban guaranteed China at the time that these Uyghurs weren't going to make any trouble, and they held on to that promise. Then later you have another group of migrants to Syria who, and I've read this before, look very different from the other people around them. They're not there for holy war so much. They're there to try and find somewhere to settle. It's a really interesting pattern. But one thing I want to get at in the little bit of time we have left is the remarkable fact that you did so much interview work with people who have been in places like Syria and Afghanistan, Turkey, and that you sorted through all of this Uyghur language Islamist material to try and understand the internal histories of these communities. And you're really pushing back in the book against what you might call the prevailing narrative in the security policy community. And I wonder if you could just briefly tell us, how different is the story that you found through interviews from the story that we would get from, say, security studies people trying to argue for, reasons to eliminate the Uyghur terrorist threat?
Yeah, I think it's quite different. I think that what I've found, and there is, of course, in security studies, there's critical terrorism studies and so on, but the general trend with terrorism studies has been, and this is in particular true about kind of the think tank world and the people who are trying to inform policy, is they rely on significant assumptions about what these organizations look like. And granted, none of us really have been able to do the field work to go and live with these organizations to see what they look like. One of the things I spent a lot of time doing in my research for this book was watching videos of one Uyghur militant group called the Turkestan Islamic Party that emerged in 2008 during the Beijing Olympics and made videos threatening the Olympics. And after that, they became very prolific video producers. And it seemed to me, from analyzing the videos, that in essence, there were only maybe less than 10 members of this organization in Waziristan, in Pakistan at the time. But they were leaving this very interesting account of what their organization was for and what it was doing. And so it was almost kind of, almost like a video ethnography of a jihadist group to go through these and look at them, and in particular, looking at them in chronological order to get a feeling of how this group had evolved and changes over time. I think one of the things that I find in looking at this, and actually in a future project, I want to look at a couple other jihadist groups from Eurasia to see how similar the situation might be. But these groups are not very organized, and they don't have a lot of capacity and a lot of resources. And it's not I think coincidental that if you look for sources on the Turkestan Islamic Party, you do not find a whole lot other than their actual materials, because this group has not been prominent in the global war on terror. And yet, everybody just in the terrorism analyst world, people will just immediately group this group. It appears to have connections to Al Qaeda as being part of this singular Al Qaeda threat. And it seems to me that that's a huge service to our national security and human security in the world, because we have, I think, in many ways misunderstood what some of these groups are really about, and what their capacity is, and how much of a threat they really are to the world. So I mean, I think that there are some people in the critical terrorism studies field who've been advocating for this kind of approach, to look at these groups really from the bottom up and see what are they about, why do people join them, what do they think they're actually doing in joining them, and I think that that would go a long way to kind of deconstructing a lot of the things that we've built up around the terrorist threat in the world over the last 20 years.
I agree. It's funny, I remember watching a lot of those videos back in the day when they were first coming out, and it was strange and kind of traumatizing for me, because sometimes a lot of the videos were just something by like a Pakistani group where they had added some Uyghur dubbing to it. And sometimes you'd see someone getting killed. It had no obvious connection to any Uyghur issue, except that they found someone to read Uyghur over it. And it was really difficult to tease out what those connections were. So I admire your fortitude in going through all of that. But it does bring to mind a question. One of your contentions throughout the book is that none of these organizations had much in the way of capacity. They couldn't really do anything. But the Turkestan Islam Party, the Turkestan Islamic Party, was very good at making videos. And is the threat to Chinese security not so much organized terrorism within? Is the threat perhaps like, what would you call it, stochastic terrorism, that people will be inspired to independently carry out acts? What do you think of that?
I thought about that a lot while writing the book, because you can see actually in the state's reaction that it was, in part of its conception of going after the Uyghur population writ large, is this assumption that it can be radicalized, and that these people are providing, the food for thought that would allow that to happen. I think one of the missing links in that, of course, is that there's not a whole lot of evidence that these videos made their way significantly around the Uyghur population in China. And I think that that's something that would be a really interesting follow-on research to find out to what degree these things really did get around. I imagine that there was a small window of period where they may have, but you see, already starting in 2014, the Great Firewall is very different in the Uyghur region. It's much more difficult to get around. You often see people say, well, yeah, there's this Great Firewall, but everybody in China uses a VPN. Well, in the Uyghur region, if you're detected using a VPN, you're arrested, you're put into an internment camp, or you're put into prison. So there is probably a window where people were able to access some of these videos, but it would be really interesting to know what that exact window was. That could fill in some, I think some gray areas in what happened. But I also think it's important to note, as I said, I do not believe that what the government is doing now is a response to that perceived threat. I think that's, I think that there are probably lots of lower level officials who do buy into that narrative, who do think that what they're doing is ensuring that the safety of China and the safety of the Uyghur region, and even the safety of Uyghurs. But I think that at the higher levels, what's happening obviously has much more behind it, and it's not, and I can't believe that the Chinese intelligence capacity is not good enough to understand the real extent of any kind of terrorist threat, particularly from abroad.
It's interesting because I think one of the things you're saying here is that, since 2017, we've seen the emergence of this massive system of re-education, imprisonment, detention, forced labor, all of these things, which, if they are a response to a perceived extremist threat, seem like a massive overreaction to it, or a massively disproportional reaction to the level of violence, which is overall quite low, that has been seen. And on that point, you mentioned how the project changed as conditions changed. Similarly for me, I finished the draft of my book in 2016 as a dissertation. And then the next year, most of my colleagues were disappeared. And what I thought was going to be a story about how the Chinese state used to be interested in assimilating Muslims to this idea of Chineseness back in the late 19th century, suddenly it was front and center again, because we've seen all these programs that are meant to inculcate what the party secretary of the region called normalcy, being a normal person. Can you briefly comment on who designed this system that's been in place since 2017? Who, if we can point a finger at anyone, who is responsible? Who is the architect of this massive system of internment and censorship that we've seen? And I think that'll have to be our last question before we turn to the Q&A.
So, I think one of the things I do push back on in the book is this assertion that Chen Guangguo, who became party secretary of the Uyghur region around in late 2016, if I remember correctly, that he was the architect. But one of the things I found was that in 2014, when the government started the People's War on Terror, they already started putting in a lot of the infrastructure for what they were going to do in 2017. They started to develop this massive database to collect information on individual Uyghurs. They completely expanded the electronic surveillance. They even were beta testing ideas of re-education on a smaller level. So I don't believe that Chen Guangguo was really the architect of this. He becomes the implementer of it. But I have to assume, and I'm not a political scientist, so I don't kind of venture into the internal politics of the elite of the CCP in China. But I have to believe that it really comes from the very top of the party, and Xi Jinping is obviously very much up it. And I think, one of the things I think that is important to understand is that all these things start happening in 2014 as Xi Jinping is really starting to run the country. And some of our colleagues, of course, are looking at the nationality policies of China, and you definitely see that Xi Jinping has cultivated a very different idea of the country's tolerance of religious and ethnic diversity. And so I think that I do think I don't know if Xi Jinping himself came up with the idea for mass internment camps, but I certainly believe that he fully endorsed it, whoever came up with these ideas.
Yeah. Okay, well, this has been a very productive conversation, and it's generated a lot of questions from the audience, which is, I have to say, it's quite a large audience. You've attracted a number of people. So I'm going to start picking questions from them. And here's one that is frequently on my mind, because it's also this kind of question of why isn't the world more responsive? What has been the response towards this conflict from the global Muslim community? So what about countries with large Muslim populations such as Indonesia? And if so, is this a result of China's financial relationship with these countries? Is it that China is sort of buying off Muslim countries and keeping them from speaking up? What's happening there? Why doesn't Pakistan do or say more?
So I do think that, first of all, it's important before even addressing Muslim countries. We've seen twice now where, and I fear, if all the analysts who are saying that we're headed towards a more conflictual relationship with China, if they are indeed right about that, people are going to look back at these two incidents at the UN where the US and several other democracies were putting pressure on the UN to address this issue, and China was able to get a counter letter signed by more countries supporting what China was doing and saying that it was an appropriate response to a terrorist threat. And those countries, some people will point to the fact that among those countries are many autocratic countries, but there are also a lot of developing countries. And China is expanding its economic reach into the developing world and is filling a void that I think the U.S. has left behind. So for a lot of developing countries, they're very welcoming of Chinese investment. And so from the state's perspective, and you see this certainly in Central Asia, which borders on this region and has people who are related to those who are suffering in the Uyghur region, the states would prefer that this problem didn't exist. They don't want to deal with it whatsoever. And that's the case in most of the Muslim world. But what is different is that I think among Muslim populations around the world who are aware of this problem, it is very concerning. And so what you do see in the Muslim world is states that have more democratic systems are feeling more pressure from their population to speak out about this. And Indonesia, in fact, is one of those countries. Some of the political parties in Indonesia have been advocating very hard that Indonesia should take a stance on this. And I think some of the people studying Indonesian politics have suggested it's become a domestic political issue, the parties use against each other. And similarly, Turkey is walking a very fine line on this question. They have spoken out about what's happening to Uyghurs in China, but at the same time, they have continued working very closely with China, and perhaps are even considering extradition of some Uyghurs to China. So I think that it's a difficult situation, and I think for a lot of developing countries, even if they see it as very disturbing, they are weighing, whether this is that important to them in comparison to what they're benefiting from in terms of Chinese investment. And I think this is going to be an increasing issue in the Muslim world going forward. I've found, since my book came out, some of the only people who've written me out of the blue, just readers who I didn't know, who wanted to say good things about my book, were from the Muslim world, and they were very concerned about the issue, and they were also asking me what they can do. So I think there's going to be more and more pressure, because I think an issue like this can't remain a secret forever.
Yeah, no, the report came out recently about cross-border sort of Pakistani Uyghur couples who were not uncommon when I lived in the region. And their desperate attempts to rejoin their families when Pakistan is not being helpful at all. In the meantime, I think it's very telling that a lot of the information that we have about the re-education system comes from Kazakhs, who are part of cross-border China-Kazakhstan marriages and families, and on that basis were freed or got out of their positions or got across the border. We're able to give testimony in places like Almaty. So I think this is definitely going to become a larger issue, and I'm actually kind of glad to hear that it might. On a very similar line, I know you're not a political scientist, neither am I, haha. But this is a question that a lot of people are asking. I know that you've been in touch with political figures on this as well, right? And that you've spoken with people in the NGO communities. We have a policy-oriented question from Professor Gerrit van der Wees, which is, how can the US, Europe, and its allies in the region convince the Chinese government to cease its repressive measures and move towards respect for Uyghur culture, identity, and human rights? And again, this is a tricky thing because I think, as you pointed out earlier, the US is kind of withdrawn from the region, and China is already filling the vacuum that is left. So what are the options left at this point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems, something I've said in numerous discussions with people, is that, this should be a humanitarian issue. And one of the things that I'm concerned about is the United States is increasingly turning it into a geopolitical issue. It's gotten entangled with disagreements on a variety of issues that the Trump administration has with China. And that is a disservice in many ways, I think, to the general cause. I mean, on the one hand, I think some of the things the US government is doing are very good. In particular, the US government's trying to scrutinize products coming out of China to see to what extent, either the products themselves or parts of the products have been produced, using coerced Uyghur labor, or even companies that are involved in the construction of the internment camps and so on. I think that's very important. I would like to see that be more of a grassroots movement, just because that divorces it from this geopolitical debate. And I know Eric knows this. Those of us who've been trying to talk about this issue, there is skepticism from all kinds of quarters who think that this is made up by the United States government, that this is not really happening. And I think that's a fringe belief, but it can particularly in this era of social media, it can be something that gains a lot of steam and just creates doubt, and I think, the urgency of this problem, it doesn't allow for time for doubt.
Yeah, the urgency of the problem is a major issue, and it's very bad to get sort of Holocaust denialism level conspiracy theorizing in the midst of all of it to distract from what really should be an issue with great moral clarity, especially given that the Chinese government itself has put out a white paper detailing the system of re-education and trying to cast in a positive light. We know this all exists. It's empirically verifiable. But what you do with that information is now something that says a lot about you as a person, I think.
Yeah, and I'll just note, one hope is, I think that I think that the U.S., really needs to address this issue with a group of countries together. The U.S. should not be leading the issue because of all the sensitivities in U.S.-Chinese relations right now. And I would like to see more, more discussion among countries as how they can address this issue as a group, and not just European countries, but also countries in the developing world, because I think even countries that are getting a lot of Chinese investment are looking at this, and that's raising other questions about China's influence in their country.
This gets us back to the question of forced labor, because it seems like if I want to get my colleague Rahila Davut out of prison, one of the ways we have to do it is to write letters to H&M or Zara, telling them to check their supply lines. It's a bizarrely roundabout way of going about global politics. And on a related note, we have a question from John Levine, who's asking whether the economic downturn caused by COVID and the new economic circumstances has played a role in the PRC of maybe forcing more Uyghurs into forced or coerced labor in order to boost the economy. Do you have any perspective on how the situation's evolved under COVID-19?
Yeah, I think
you might not know.
Yeah. I don't know in terms of the economic pressures on Chinese manufacturing. One of the things I mentioned, my book was all ready to go out at the beginning of this summer, and COVID-19 kind of delayed its publication. And the publisher said, well, you can write a foreword to discuss how COVID-19 is impacting this situation. And my worry is more that the Chinese government is using this time during COVID to try to normalize this situation, to perhaps erase some of the most egregious things like some of the mass internment camps and move Uyghurs increasingly into these labor schemes. I know one of our colleagues, Tim Gross, has been kind of tracking this in terms of the Chinese internet, and he's found forums where there's brokers who are basically trying to sell Uyghur workers to factories inside China, and the factories aren't running to pick them up. They're asking all kinds of questions. How good's their Chinese? So I don't think that I don't think that this is being driven by the needs of Chinese industry as much as it is kind of an assimilation strategy and a displacement strategy that is, conveniently also productive.
Mm-hmm. So it's something the Chinese government is trying to use like the logic of the market to fill factories with retrained Uyghur workers who usually had a perfectly good skill beforehand.
Yeah.
Geez. Well, on a similar note then, so George Washington student Ryan Rosenthal wants to know about something that I think has been on our minds for a long time, and that's the role of technology. We often talk about Xinjiang as this sort of futuristic digital authoritarian state. So what is the role of that digital authoritarianism in this system of repression?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And one of the things in my conclusion, I try to note why people should care about this situation. And one of the things I note is that this should raise red flags for everybody. And I look at it from a bunch of different angles, and one of them is technology. I mean, what the Chinese government's doing in the Uyghur region in terms of electronic surveillance, essentially, every state in the world now has the capacity to do that. And if not, they can buy it from China. And it's more about how it's being implemented. We hear a lot about the artificial intelligence and the facial recognition software that's involved in the surveillance. But to me, the most concerning part of it is that they've created this massive database. So all of the information from the surveillance flows into this massive database, which they started constructing in 2014, and it's called the IJOP, Integrated Joint Operations Platform. And it basically allows somebody sitting at a computer with access to the database, if you come through a checkpoint, I can look up everything you've been doing. I can look up your telephone communications. I can see from CCTV cameras with facial recognition where you've been today. I can see who you've been communicating with. I can also see records from your employer and so on. And a lot of the surveillance that goes into the database is not only electronically gathered, but also gathered by humans. So one of the creepiest parts about the surveillance, particularly in rural areas, is they've sent literally hundreds of thousands of cadres to rural communities to live in families' homes and take notes on their behaviors and what they have in their house, whether they drink alcohol, because not drinking alcohol could be a sign of being an extremist. So that to me, and that's something that always concerns me about technology. Having lived in the former Soviet Union, where compromat, which many people know since the 2016 elections, is the gathering of compromising information on people. Having this ongoing database about everybody's activities is something that I think everybody should resist anywhere in the world.
I remember the early stages of that database. It didn't quite work at first, but then all of a sudden it really, really functioned. And everything was just wired. Quite surprising how well they could track you. And there's an interesting piece I read recently about like a young Uyghur man who basically signed up to be a supplemental police officer and gradually started doing more and more. And then he started monitoring people's communications and doing data analysis. And then he ended up as like a prison guard, punishing and moving prisoners. So the question to you then is, we're reading all these accounts of what the police are doing or what the security state is doing in the region. We have a question here from GW Elliott School alumnus Robert Davis, who would like us to elaborate on which specific branches of the Chinese government are conducting this kind of repression. Is it the military? Is it state security? Is it the police? Can we be more specific, or has it simply grown beyond all divisions in the bureaucry? What do you know about this?
Yeah, I mean, I do think one of the tricky things about trying to assign responsibility to entities in China for things, and this is something that I think is becoming clearer and clearer as we're talking about looking at companies like Huawei, for example, that there's essentially, the line between the private sector and the public sector is significantly blurred. And the legislation in China basically allows the state to request any kind of information it wants from private entities. And unlike in the United States, where a private entity can push back on that in court, that's not going to happen in China. So I think that there is a lot of blurred area. I mean, certainly the Public Security Bureau has always been the main local kind of enforcer of security issues. But I think, at the same time, as Eric knows very well, I remember hearing him write a paper on this about the Binghuan, the Xinjiang
Production and Construction Corps.
Yes, which is a paramilitary organization that had kind of settlements in Xinjiang beginning early on in the PRC period, but continues to be both an economic actor and a security actor. So, obviously they are also very much involved, as is, of course, all of the local governance structures throughout the Uyghur region. So I think that what you see is that it becomes more and more difficult to parse out the good guys and the bad guys in the situation.
I completely agree. So for those who don't know, the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps is like a province within a province. So you have Xinjiang and then the Construction Corps, and they both exist on top of each other, such that you have the Corps has been called the world's third largest corporation by some, and an autonomous region that's really not very autonomous, and all of these complex relations between them and between the central state. And it is incredibly hard to tease out who's responsible for what at times. And so if you want to fight this problem, you're fighting a hydra. You cut off one head and another one grows. Speaking of diffuseness, I want to turn to a couple of questions about identity in China. And the first one goes back to what you said about how not drinking alcohol is a sign of extremism. Well, apparently so is not smoking. So is growing a beard. So are all sorts of things that you're an ordinary Han Chinese person in, say, Jiangsu would be okay to do. That might be considered a little bit weird, but that's a normal thing to do. But if you're a Uyghur now, and you don't eat pork or you don't smoke, that's considered extreme behavior. What does this have to do with China's emerging nationalist rhetoric? This is a question from GW student Brevin Anderson. And I think what Brevin's trying to get at is, how does trying to make a new kind of Uyghur person relate to the broader articulation of a Chineseness throughout the PRC?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think that first of all, one of the things I tackle in my book a little bit is this tension that I think has always existed in the relationship between modern China and Uyghurs, which is, on the one hand, and this is a typical colonial dilemma, that they want the other to be more like them, while at the same time never really accepting them as being the same. And I think for Uyghurs, this has an added dimension of complexity, because if we borrow some of the terminology in American studies of racial formations, Uyghurs, it's very difficult for Uyghurs to pass as Chinese. They're racially different looking for the most part. There's some Uyghurs who can pass as Chinese, but certainly not all of them. And I think they're probably the largest ethnic group other than the Han that looks the most different from the Han. And so this I think creates some problems in trying to make them into Chinese. But I think that there is a growing body of literature coming out about this problem from people who've been focusing on this kind of mirror image of identity making. David Tobin has a new book out where he's looking at this issue as how it reflects on kind of the Chinese idea of security. And also, I think that there's also a question that came up in another Sigur Center event recently when we were talking about Benno Wiener's book about Tibet, where you have you have a situation. This is part of an ongoing process of modern China in nation building, and I think this has always been a very difficult issue for China, because the Han, as a people themselves, could be viewed in many different ways as many groups of different people or one singular people, and I think that the nation building process in China has been fraught with all kinds of problems, and perhaps some of the policies that are being taken against non-Han people right now are reflective of some of those problems in trying to build a national ideal. And the last point I'd make about that is also that I do think that under Xi Jinping there is a sense that they're abandoning the kind of concept of a multicultural, multinational nation, which makes it even more difficult, because how do you take a multicultural nation and make it into a uniform nation? That's extremely problematic.
Absolutely. And this has been an effort on the part of the Chinese government for quite a while now. I'd say since the late 90s, is to find a way out of assigning nationality to people and thereby reifying the boundaries between them. Some of the ideas put forth about that have been very naive. Ma Rong, who's a very influential theorist, thinks that because America has solved its race problem, according to him, China should also get rid of any sort of labels and be just like America and let people work it out gradually among themselves. There seems to be a real disconnect in some ways between the policy of assimilation formulated at the top and the way it's implemented on the ground. Because now we're seeing that even though grid-style management and assimilation, re-education have led to discontent in places like Tibet and Xinjiang, now these same policies are spreading to places like majority Hui or Chinese-speaking Muslim regions, and even into Inner Mongolia, where all of a sudden they're banning Mongolian language teaching. This leads to a question by a GW student, Min Wang, who asks, do you think there's a possibility of cooperation, support, or sympathy from other minority groups within China towards the Uyghurs? And if so, what would the most plausible support system be? There used to be very little solidarity. Has that changed?
Well, I mean, so one thing that did change, and I remember when we started to see the first reports that there were Kazakhs in these mass internment camps. And that was very puzzling to me, because Uyghurs inside China had long told me that the government had essentially a kind of a divide and conquer strategy with the Uyghurs and Kazakhs. And you could see maybe the logic of that, given that unlike in former Soviet Central Asia, you had two very short-lived independent states in the Uyghur region that were both deliberately framed as pan-Turkic and multinational. So in the 30s and 40s, you had two states that were developed where it was not identified as a Uyghur nation state. They were defined as East Turkestan, and part of the reason for that is that they had Kazakhs and Tatars and Uzbeks in the ruling elite. And I think the Chinese government for a long time had kind of broken down those ties. But this all of a suddenly we have this new solidarity between Uyghurs and Kazakhs over this issue. And as one Kazakh from China told me, it's kind of like reconstituting the Eastern Turkestan identity, and so I think the bigger problem is, what does solidarity mean in present day China? I think that what we're seeing right now, there may be subtle ways of resistance that are happening on the ground that we're not privy to right now. But it seems that the policies being put in action in the Uyghur region have completely immobilized any ability to resist. And part of that is the surveillance and the stick that if you resist, you immediately get put in some sort of penal institution, whether it's an internment camp or a prison. But it will be interesting to see what happens in Mongolia, and whether in Mongolia, where there seems to be ability, we've seen actually indications that there's protests about this language education issue on the ground. It'll be interesting to see how the Chinese government deals with that. Yeah.
And people in Mongolia are much more wired, much more able to get their videos online too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking the one thing I've noticed is Hong Kong protesters looking to Xinjiang as an example of what might happen to their own claimed homeland, right? So, okay, we have a few questions and only about 10 minutes left. And let's see, I think this might be a shorter one. Penn State professor Tessa Eftimiadis is wondering why the Uyghur crisis is not as widely known as it should be. Is it because the CCP is silencing it internally with censorship, or is it an issue with foreign media? Here's a good question. How are things like press credentials and journalist visas playing into this situation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is always a funny question. I hear it a lot, but I'm sure Eric would agree with me. After studying Uyghurs for a long time, it's funny to hear people say it's not getting much attention, because it's getting a lot more attention than it ever did before. But indeed, I think that there is some issue. I mean, there's a major issue about getting information out of the region right now. And over the summer, they did revoke the press credentials of a lot of the Western journalists who had been covering this. And there were some really great journalists based out of Beijing primarily, who were able to get out to the region since 2017 multiple times and get information, even though they found they were unable to actually talk to Uyghurs about anything substantive, because Uyghurs were far too scared to talk to foreign journalists, and they weren't able to get very close to the re-education internment camps because they would be stopped by security immediately. But still, there was information coming out. But I think the final point that's worth bringing up, is I do think that the global Islamophobia tempers the empathy that a lot of the world has for what's happening to Uyghurs, and this continual kind of doubt, of, well, maybe it is really a terrorist threat, that there is some justification, and maybe it's overreaction, but I can understand why the Chinese government's concerned, and I think that's problematic.
On exactly that point, Dina, who's an Elliott School student, has asked the chicken and the egg problem. This is covered very clearly in your book, and I think your answer is yes. But has Western Islamophobia contributed to the repression of the Uyghurs and other Muslim people in the region? Mm-hmm. I think your argument is that it was foundational to the way that oppression has happened since the year 2001. But if you could elaborate briefly.
Yeah, I think one important, I'll be really brief about this, but there's an important story in my book that we haven't talked about yet, which is that, the Chinese government immediately after 9/11 tried to, they put out some white papers, policy papers, saying that virtually every Uyghur diaspora political organization in the world was linked to Al-Qaeda. And most states in the world did not listen to this at all. They just kind of brushed it off. People knew about Uyghur human rights organizations in their countries. They knew they weren't terrorists. But in 2002, in the summer of 2002, the US government suddenly changed its tune, and it recognized this one group in Afghanistan that was mentioned in some of these policy papers as a terrorist organization. It put it on the US terrorism exclusion list, and it also helped the Chinese government get it on the UN consolidated lists of terrorist groups. And I think that had massive impact on the Uyghur people all over the world. It created doubt about their situation. It justified more state violence to suppress any kind of political voices inside China. And it allowed China also to use a lot of whataboutism and just say, well, but we're fighting terrorists just like you. I mean, Guantanamo Bay internment camp is also an extra legal internment camp, which is absolutely true. But yeah, so I do think that it was foundational, and I think that it's a cautionary tale about where the global war on terror is moving and how it's morphed globally. And in my mind, there's an urgency to put an end to the war as we conceive of it now, and find what actually is the problem that we're trying to solve.
So I have two questions, and I think they should be relatively short. One is from Parhat Kiyim, who asks about the greater identity crisis within China. It asks whether the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has accepted this idea of the depoliticization of ethnicity, that is, the elimination of passport ethnicity, and is therefore pursuing swifter, more accelerated assimilation of non-Han ethnic groups.
Yeah, I mean, it does appear that is the case, and Eric had mentioned this, since the 1990s, there's been some Chinese scholars who've been talking about this idea of taking away official nationality as an identity and something that's on your passport and so on. And a lot of people, a lot of Western scholars were paying attention to that. A lot of them, though, saying that, well, this seems to be somewhat on kind of the margins of Chinese policy discussions. Xi Jinping really starts to take this idea much more seriously, and particularly, it seems there's evidence around 2014 that the government's looking at the Uyghur region as kind of a test case for this issue. So the first Xinjiang Work Forum, the first one was in 2000. It was after 2009 Urumshi Riots. So the second one in 2014. They really start talking about these ideas of that we're all part of a pomegranate, and we're all seeds of one whole unit. There does seem to be this movement and I think what's happening to other non-Han people right now, we're hearing about potentially the expansion of internment camps to Tibet. We're hearing about the destruction of mosques in Hui areas and attempts to regulate how religious observation is done there. We're hearing about the language issues in Mongolia. It seems that there is kind of a larger idea of trying to get rid of difference and diversity. So I see it as a very kind of, it's kind of a reactionary position towards the problem of diversity.
It's funny, in your book, in several places, you point out moments when the party and state could have done something very differently, when they could have made the other choice, not to engage in, frankly, very ham-handed and counterproductive policies with regard to ethnicity and identity, but could have actually emphasized the things that do tend to draw their non-Han citizens into loyalty to the state. And they did not choose to do that, but pursued other policies. So I left this question for last because I'm not sure whether you or I or anyone has an answer to it. But we're a couple weeks away from the biggest election of our lives. And Mel White from Penn State would like to know your thoughts about how would a potential Biden administration address the Uyghur crisis in terms of U.S.-China relations, for example, with the terrorist designation or some other policy. Do we have a sense of what a Biden administration might do differently?
Yeah, I think I just saw yesterday a policy paper put out by the Center for American Progress, which is very influential in Democratic Party policy circles in terms of foreign policy. And it outlines what a Biden administration should do in the first 100 days in foreign policy. So I didn't read through the whole document yet, but I scanned it quickly to make sure that Uyghurs were in there. And indeed they were. And they were suggesting that a Biden administration should address this issue early on in the first 100 days and should speak to the Uyghur community in the U.S. about it, but also should further everything that's stipulated in the Uyghur Human Rights Protection Act in terms of sanctioning Chinese officials who are proven to be complicit and involved in the repression of Uyghurs. So it didn't look a whole lot different. I think that, but some of the other things in the paper were talking more generally about a Biden administration's need to create or to reestablish the United States allies around the world, and also that the U.S. should not lead, but should join joint efforts. And I think this is important. This is a major difference between the Obama administration and the Trump administration and its foreign policy. Obama really wanted to use the power of the U.S. to get consensus, or at least a consensus among important states on important issues, and then use the power of all those states to push that issue. And I think that, that's something that the United States could really try to do with the Uyghur issue, is build, a coalition and not be the leader, but really create a collective voice of outrage about what's happening and demanding that the Chinese state changes its behavior.
And speaking of leaders and followers, you mentioned the Uyghur Human Rights Act. I mean, that was a product of many years of effort by groups like the Uyghur Human Rights Project here in DC. So, there are people leading on this issue all around the country, and there has been a grassroots movement growing the past few years. And we can hope that that'll become more of a part of the dialogue in the coming years. But it is time. So, Sean, thank you so much for the privilege of speaking with you. It's been a real pleasure. I've learned a lot. I hope everyone has. And although our webinar draws now to a close, a recording of the event, links to purchase the book, and the giveaway winner will be sent out next week to all of the attendees. So next week, you'll get that link, which is in the chat right now, with a discount code for 30% off. And if you won the giveaway, you'll hear about it soon. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending.
Yes,
See you next time.